That is Dan Patterson. He is the prosecutor in the case of Missouri versus Nick Godejohn. And you may have noticed that he's pounding away on this deliberation element. Here's why. Remember, this is a first-degree murder case. What do you need for that? You need malice aforethought. You need intention. You need deliberation. It has to be something you've thought about. You have plotted. And it doesn't have to happen over a long period of time, although in this case I think the facts will suggest it did. It could happen like that. On the phone with me via Skype is Matt Mangino. He's a criminal defense attorney. Matt, welcome. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining. So let me ask you about that issue, the deliberation. Why so important that the prosecution is pounding away on that so early?
Well, the first-degree murder statute specifically says that you have to have deliberation. So you know, you can, as you said, you can get that intent to kill in a moment, but you also have to have deliberation. There has to be planning. And the prosecution is trying to lay out that there certainly was deliberation, not only over a long period of time, but right before Nicholas Godejohn committed this murder. So it's very important, and they're methodically making sure that the jury understands what deliberation is.
Yeah, and it seems like he made a number of decisions along the way. Matt, stay right where you are. We'll be checking in with you through the course of this trial today. Let's see what the defense has to say about this whole concept of deliberation. Remember, the defendant has autism. Would that negate the deliberation? Let's see what the defense has to say.
Clothes hangers. Gypsy was not allowed to leave her mother. She wasn't allowed to be free. And she wanted a relationship outside of her home. She wanted a relationship with Nick. They talked about murder a year before it happened, but Gypsy formulated another plan. Why don't I try to bring you into my life, introduce you, my mom will get to know you, and we'll go from there. Gypsy stole some money from her mom, sent it to Nick, purchased a bus ticket. Nick drove down on a bus from Wisconsin for the first time in 2015, in March of 2015, and stayed in a hotel that Gypsy paid for. Now, the idea was that they were going to go to an IMAX movie. They were going to go see Cinderella together. And they did. They both met there at the movie theater, talked to one another as if they'd never met before, like they didn't have any idea who each other was. And Gypsy's hope was that she would bond with this man in front of her mother, develop a friendship, and that her mother would accept that. Ultimately, they sat next to one another during that movie, and eventually they were able to get out of the theater. They went into the men's room and had sexual intercourse. When they went back into the theater, Gypsy's mother made sure they didn't sit next to one another. And Gypsy was heartbroken. She wanted her mom to accept Nick, and her mom described Nick as creepy. Gypsy knew there was only one way she was going to be able to spend a life with Nick. There was only one way to get out from under the grasp of her mother, and that was to kill her mother. Nick arrived there at the house. Knife was ready, gloves were ready, tape was ready. He entered that home and saw Gypsy standing there. A girl who could walk, not someone captive in a wheelchair. Looking around the living room, there were wheelchairs. The devices that bound her. And Nick went through with Gypsy's plan.
So we can see what the defense is working on here. This is the blame the other defendant that's not sitting at the table defense. Remember, Gypsy Rose was the daughter of the ultimate victim. And the backstory is incredible. We're going to get into it in detail as we uncover the nuggets within this case. But if you've heard of the concept of Munchausen Syndrome, and even more creepy, Munchausen Syndrome by proxy, you're going to see what that attention-seeking kind of mental defect does to the ultimate victim in this case, and maybe more importantly to her daughter, Gypsy Rose. Still with me is Matt Mangino. Matt, What do you think about this concept of you're not blaming the victim, which is always dicey, but you're blaming really a co-defendant who's not sitting at the defense table?
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, if you're going to have a justification defense, the justification should be because the defendant was abused or the defendant was subject to abuse over a period of time. But to suggest that somehow the defendant is justified in killing Dee Dee Blanchard because she abused her daughter is really a stretch. And it's going to make it very difficult for the defense to convince a jury that somehow Nicholas Godejohn is justified for what he did because of what the victim did to Gypsy Blanchard.
Okay, so what do you think is the best maneuver here? What is the best defense for this situation?
Well, I mean, they have their hands full. The defense has their hands full. I mean, you know, there's no question that Nicholas Godejohn committed this offense. The issue is, did he have some sort of diminished capacity? Not is he innocent of killing Dee Dee Blanchard, but does he have some diminished capacity, some mitigation that would result in this case, not ending up as a first-degree murder? That's their primary job here, not to convince the jury he didn't do it, but there was some diminished capacity, some mitigation that the jury should consider when determining what the offense is in this case. So
the bottom line is, let's negate that the deliberateness to any action by the defendant. We keep him out of jail for the rest of his life, right? Pretty much that's the plan.
That seems to be the plan here, because they're not suggesting he didn't commit the murder, only that because of his diminished capacity and his manipulation by Gypsy Blanchard that he carried out this offense.
Okay. And what a first date it was. I can't go too far without mentioning that. You go to the movies with mom, and then you have sex in the bathroom. I mean, pretty much a typical first date. We're going to take a look at an interview and a taped statement by the defendant, Nicholas Godejohn, when we come right back. Is it a confession?
And did you use the same knife that you did the others with?
Yeah.
Okay. And when you did the cross the back of the neck, did that even cause an injury, or did you see any blood or anything?
Yeah, she was bleeding.
Okay, she's bleeding. And so did she scream or holler? Or?
Yeah, she did.
What was she saying?
First she said help, and then she didn't know. She didn't recognize who I was. And she said, who are you? And then
she said, who are you?
Yeah.
Okay. And she didn't recognize who you are. She says help, and then what does she say?
And then she called for Gypsy, but she didn't do anything.
Okay. She hollered for Gypsy.
Yes.
Did she holler for Gypsy once, twice, 5 times?
3 times.
3 times? And what was she saying? Can you tell me how she said it?
She pretty much yelped it.
Yelped it?
It's like,
Gypsy. Okay.
Yeah, she was loud.
And what did you do when she did that?
It didn't stop me from keep on going.
Okay. You just kept stabbing her?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know where those 4 deep ones were? Are you counting the one in the back of the neck or not in that 4?
No.
Okay, so the back of the neck would be something different.
Yeah.
Wow. Chilling for 2 reasons. First of all, just the gruesome detail, but maybe more importantly, how just matter of fact and nonchalant, hey, we're just having a cup of coffee here talking about how I butchered this woman. Not a big deal. And the investigators doing a great job of keeping things kind of casual in that sense. Did you use the same knife? Oh, yeah, I did. The same one to stab her that you used to slice the back of her neck? Oh, yeah. Yeah, same knife, multi-purpose knife. It all worked. And did you ask Gypsy Rose to come in and help at any point? No, I would never have done that. She asked me to kill her mother. And that, at this point, is the upshot of that interview, which couldn't be more damning against Nicholas Godejohn. With me still, Matt Mangino, criminal defense attorney. How do you think this is going if you're representing this guy?
Well, it's not good. And, the first problem is that he's there by himself, unrepresented. It's never a good idea when you're a suspect or accused of a crime to sit down with investigators without legal representation, or to sit down and talk with investigators at all. So that's the first mistake here. But as you said, his affect is very cold and just calculating, just matter of fact, which may be attributed to some extent to his autism spectrum. But it certainly is. Makes your blood boil when you listen to his nonchalant way of describing the murder.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right too, and I hate to say this in a punning way, but it cuts both ways. You've got a guy who's mentally defective to some degree. Maybe his matter of fact effect here is because of that. And if that's true, maybe he couldn't really understand what she was asking him to do or deliberate on the right or wrong or to create the malice of forethought that was necessary. I think you're right. It could go either way at this point if you're arguing for the defense of this gentleman. Now, we've heard the details of the crime. That ain't all. Get ready. We're going to hear about what Mr. Godejohn had planned after the murder when we come back.
And then she gets out of the bathroom, is her legs shaved and everything's shaved, and then what happens?
And then we start to clean up the ground and everything around.
Okay, clean up, what do you clean in the house?
Yes.
You're like vacuuming and dusting and stuff like that?
Cleaning up such as anything that has memories of her. That's actually what we're doing.
I don't understand, I'm sorry.
Like anything that had, she took some pictures away and she actually threw them in the trash. She tried to get rid of things that would give you guys the idea that she really lives there.
Oh, okay. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay, so did you guys clean up any blood or anything?
Yes.
Okay, what kind of blood got cleaned up?
I believe it must have been mine because I accidentally stabbed myself.
That is some interesting detail about Mr. Godejohn's plan with Gypsy Rose following the murder. Let me just give you some age context here because you hear these folks talking. Mr. Godejohn at the moment, he's 29, but he does have autism. He's on the spectrum. He sounds younger than that. And Gypsy Rose, his girlfriend, 27 at the time, I think when you hear her testimony, which we will have coming up for you, it's striking how young she sounds. Matt Mangino, criminal defense attorney with me, how do you think the details of the post-murder plan impact, the defense in this case? What are they going to have to deal with here?
Well, their plans were very detailed, from how the murder was going to be committed and to what they were going to do after the murder was committed. So this wasn't something that was done in the heat of passion. This wasn't something that was done on a whim. This was well planned, every detail from beginning until end. So the idea that this was some sort of crime of passion certainly wouldn't fly in this situation.
And that's definitely the crux of the case. Was it something he deliberated on? Was it not? And now we have these details about the post-murder plan, which, as you suggest, just reinforces that there was more going on here than just kind of a flash in the pan, right?
Right. There was no question that they planned this out, and they planned it out over an extended period of time, and they planned out every detail. As you may hear from the testimony going forward, they deliberated over exactly how this was going to happen, what the weapon was going to be, how they were going to set the whole process up, and then ultimately what they had planned for after the murder was committed. So this is not something that just they flew off the handle and he was mad because of the abuse. No, that's not present here. What's present here is deliberation, which is a fundamental element of first-degree murder.
And one of the details we know for the defense is that, hey, Gypsy Rose gave him the glove and the knife to use in the murder of Dee Dee. So that helps the defense. Let's take a look now at further interrogation. Remember, we've been talking about this Munchausen Syndrome and how it affects the mother-daughter relationship here, how the mother wanted attention, and in this case seemed to get it by creating fantasy illnesses for her daughter. In fact, suggested she couldn't walk, pushed her around in a wheelchair. Well, what did Mr. Godejohn know about that? Let's find out.
So you go to the room, and you're up in the room, and you guys are relaxing on top of the covers. Is that what you said?
Yep.
Okay, and then what do you do?
And then while we were relaxing, we cuddled for a while.
Okay.
And then while we were cuddling, we were talking, but honestly, I can't remember the entire conversation.
Okay. Did you guys talk about your future? What was your plans for your future?
We wanted to a family together, and we wanted to build a life together and stuff. We thought we really had a chance to do it, so we were happy about that.
Okay. At any time during any of this whole situation that's happened, did Gypsy ever have to be in a wheelchair?
Yes.
Okay, when was that?
That was only when she was living at home.
Okay.
Otherwise, me and maybe like five other people knew that she could walk.
Oh, okay. Why did nobody know she could walk?
Her mom wanted everyone thinking that she was like 16 carry time. So, yeah, she felt kind of trapped on a wheelchair when I actually was trying to encourage her to go more and more.
Okay, so she can actually walk.
Yep.
And stand and do everything.
Yep.
But her mom wanted her to use the wheelchair and pretend like she was 16?
Yeah, 16 and disabled, yes.
Okay, so what would she do to pretend like she's disabled?
Oh, gosh, I can't even answer that question because I've only been around her one time when she's in her wheelchair.
Okay.
And other than that one time, I mean, it's one of those one wheelchairs where it's motorized.
Okay.
And the thing moves fast. But other than that, that's all I really know.
So Mr. Godejohn knows a little bit about this problem between the mom and daughter and the impact that these pretend illnesses might have had. What impact does that have on him and his defense? He's not done talking. When we come back, we're going to hear about what he calls his evil side and the voices that he hears in his head. Coming right back to more on the Law and Crime Network.
Well, that's like I said, I told her my part of me you're talking about, the good part of me, I refused to do it. And I told her either...
Well, is the good part of you what got you on a bus and brought you to Springfield, Missouri to kill Dee?
Well, it was it was to actually see her, but as for the killing part, that was solely my evil side.
Okay.
Solely.
I agree with you. That was your evil side. But I don't know. I mean, your evil side was with you when you made the decision to get on the bus and come to Springfield.
I agree with you on that. I agree with you on that.
Okay. And your evil side was with you whenever you decided to clean up your blood from the house. Okay? But, and now you didn't kill Gypsy, so your good side must have been there too, because you didn't kill Gypsy, because you love her, right?
Actually, it's because Gypsy likes to call about her more, I'm guessing her mom didn't really know about this side of her, but she has an evil side.
Well, apparently Mr. Godejohn's evil side is also very tidy, because that was the side that told him he needed to start cleaning up after he murdered his girlfriend's mother, Dee Blanchard, the 48-year-old. On the phone and by Skype, Matt Mangino, I'm hearing things that make me think cuckoo. You know, he's talking about his evil side. He's talking about hearing voices. You know, I'm not a doctor, but that sounds schizophrenic to me. Why are we not hearing, or would you expect we're going to hear something about schizophrenia?
This is a surprising aspect of the interview because during the course of the trial, certainly we hear that Nicholas Godejohn is suffering from, autism, level 2 on the spectrum, but we never hear anything about schizophrenia or paranoia. And hearing voices, voices that tell you to do something, would certainly be indicative of someone who might have a more serious mental illness. Not that the autism, being on the autism spectrum is not a serious problem, but certainly something that might in some way mitigate his responsibility in this case. So it's interesting that although we hear it in this interview, we don't hear anything about a diagnosis. He says that he was taking medication for hearing voices, but we don't hear anything during the course of this trial about, something more serious than the autism spectrum.
And it might have been more effective. We won't know. It doesn't seem to be part of the defense case. Let me ask you this. What about the interviewer's technique? I mean, this is not a good cop, bad cop. There's only one cop, and she seems pretty good to me. What's your take on that?
Well, she's very good. She's asking leading questions. She's letting this defendant answer those questions, but directing him in the direction that she wants to go to find the answers that she wants. Not necessarily putting words in his mouth, but making sure that he addresses issues that need to be addressed with regard to what he's talking about. So she's very effective.
Well, let's see if the defense agrees with you. We have Angela Mahoney on the stand now under cross-examination. The attorney is wondering why she treated their client like she did.
Officer Mahoney, are you aware of the autism protocol at the Greene County Sheriff's Department?
No, sir.
Is that a no?
No, sir.
Have you had any training in autism on how to handle suspects who may be on the autism spectrum?
No, sir.
Do you have any general mental health training?
Yes, sir. I do have some that were mandated to take through the sheriff's office.
Did you know that he was on the autism spectrum?
No, sir.
Had you received any kind of information that he was on the autism spectrum?
No, sir.
Now, this particular interview took place right after midnight, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it lasted about an hour and a half?
Yes, sir.
He told you he was tired,
Yes, sir.
and he seemed tired to you, is that correct?
At times when he would say he was tired, he did appear that he might be tired.
Did that cause you to question whether you should continue to question him, given the fact that he was tired and it was after midnight?
No, sir. Being tired is not a deal breaker in an interview.
Okay. Matter of fact, interviewing in the middle of the night isn't terribly uncommon, is it?
That's correct, sir.
Is there a reason that you like to interview people late at night?
I have no preference of any time of day.
He also told you he was a little bit loopy.
That is Angela Mahoney being grilled by the defense attorneys for the way she treated Nick Godejohn in that interview. So I don't know if a jury's going to look at that and say, boy, she's beating the hell out of this guy. Look how tough she is on him. But that's what the defense is suggesting, that, hey, you didn't treat him as you should because he's on the spectrum. He has autism. There are certain ways you should handle this witness, defendant or otherwise. Matt Mangino on the phone with me via Skype, criminal defense attorney. Have you dealt with, I call them, I guess, special witnesses or parties to actions that you've had to treat with kid gloves or in some special way?
Well, certainly, primarily in the area of dealing with children. You have to take into consideration a person's age and maturity. And so when we look at someone like Nicholas Godejohn, who's on the autism spectrum, which entails some inability to effectively communicate with other people, that's certainly something that you want to take into consideration here. But here the officer said that she wasn't aware that he was on the autism spectrum when she conducted this interview, and that information may not be available to the police early on during an interrogation.
And it seems to me that if during the course of the interrogation she starts to sense, something's a little off with this guy, maybe I should change tactics or something. I mean, she could have done that, right, if it seemed obvious to her.
Well, she could have, but does she have a responsibility to do that? I mean, she seemed to be. This wasn't a situation where she was in his face.
Okay, I'm going to cut you off there, Matt. We got to move on, but I'll talk to you soon. We're going to come back in just a moment with more testimony.
Were you ill during this period of time?
No, sir.
Did you ever tell Nick that you were ill or that you had illnesses?
I told him that I had illnesses, yes, sir.
Did you ever tell him that you really weren't ill?
Yes, sir.
When did you tell him you really weren't ill?
The same time that I told him that I didn't need to be in the wheelchair.
What illnesses did you believe you had?
Cancer, muscular dystrophy. I needed glasses. I needed hearing aids. Seizure disorder. And I can't remember what else.
And when did you figure out that you weren't actually sick?
I started to piece things together when I was about 19 years old. Then I didn't understand the full extent of how healthy I was until after.
That is Gypsy Rose Blanchard, 27-year-old, 27. You hear that voice, you hear that affect. It reminds me of some young girl growing up who's been artificially kind of repressed in her physical development because she doesn't sound 27, and perhaps the result of all of the abuse at the hands of her mother, some of which she just described for you there. By Skype, I've got Matt Mangino still with me, criminal defense attorney. I was just curious, obviously not the situation here. We have a third party who actually committed the murder, allegedly at the request of Gypsy Rose. But what if Gypsy Rose was the only defendant and the one wielding the knife and now has this abuse-type defense? What's your thought on that?
Well, her defense could be a straightforward justification. I've been abused at the hands of my mother from an early age. She has forced me to, just be within the home, use a wheelchair when I don't need it, suggested all these different diseases. So I killed her because I wanted to be from under her manipulation, from her suppression. And that would be a straightforward, justification defense, that I did this because of what she did to me.
And that seems very, very realistic and understandable. Not the case here. Here we have a third party involved. And who is that? That's Nicholas Godejohn, the defendant. So let's take a look and listen to more of Gypsy Rose's testimony about Nick and his involvement.
Did you and Nick ever talk about this?
Yes,
Who initially brought up killing your mother?
I did.
Why not just tell somebody rather than kill your mother? Why was that not an option?
I truly didn't believe that nobody would believe me if I told anyone. My mother had legal documents in place saying that I was incompetent, and I thought that meant that if I went to anyone, the police, or told anyone, she would just have them convinced that I was making everything up.
And what was going on in your home life that made you reach the point where you did that or made that decision?
I was growing increasingly desperate to get out of my home life.
Did you tell Nick that?
Yes.
And what was your mom doing that caused you to be more desperate?
Things were getting physically and more physically abusive. The hitting was more. The starving was more.
Now, you mentioned you were in a wheelchair. Were you required to act any certain way when you were in a wheelchair?
Yes, sir.
How was that?
She would have me stay very quiet and pretend like I couldn't walk.
That is Gypsy Rose Blanchard. She is on the stand now testifying on cross-examination. She is the daughter of the murder victim. Her boyfriend is the defendant. She was a defendant until she cut a deal for second-degree murder and got 10 years. On Skype with me is Matt Mangino. Matt, I'm going to hire you now as Mr. Godejohn's attorney. How do you handle this witness and get from her what you need to help your client?
Well, I think, that they're going to try to make some hay out of the fact that she says, hey, this was my idea, and, I forced him, Nicholas Godejohn, to go along with it. But I don't know that that's really a great line of questioning. Certainly you may want to get into it, but that doesn't provide him with any justification for what he did. The idea that she manipulated him, maybe could in some way mitigate his responsibility. She certainly says that it was her idea, but he committed the murder. It certainly doesn't look good for her, but she's already pled guilty to second-degree murder. And this case is not about her. It's about Nicholas Godejohn.
I think if she had come off on the stand as this demanding, hard-hitting young woman and not this meek, mild, kind of mousy person, I think the defense would be better off. Wouldn't they have been better off?
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly it may have in some way, provided the jury with something to feel bad about with Nicholas Godejohn, but it still doesn't make a difference. I mean, it was her plan. He joined in. He killed Dee Dee Blanchard. There's no justification for his conduct, and her testimony, it gives her some responsibility. She's not on trial. He is. I don't think her testimony does a lot for Nicholas Godejohn.
I think if she was tougher, my thought is that it makes it easier for the jury to think that she could manipulate him. As she comes off so mousy, it seems kind of like, this guy probably has his own mind, and for the defense, that's not a good thing. Let's go back into the courtroom now and watch a little more cross-examination of Gypsy Rose.
So this is a couple hours before, not about 9 o'clock on the 9th, and he says that he expects you to look like his woman should, and he suggests red fingernail polish, correct?
Yes, sir.
And do you remember you actually told him you didn't have any red fingernail polish?
Yes, sir, I remember.
And so you came up, I think, was it with pink lip gloss?
Pink.
Okay,
Yeah.
pink fingernail polish.
Mm-hmm.
And then he also, as you can see up there on the right, he wanted you to wear red lipstick, and you didn't have any of that.
That is correct.
And that's, I think, where you settled on pink lip gloss?
Yes.
Okay. When the defendant agreed to kill your mom, at some point he told you that he also wanted to rape her.
Yes, sir.
You did not want the defendant to rape your mom, correct?
Yes.
And in fact, in leaving the decision of how to kill her up to the defendant, you never told him to stab her 17 separate times, right?
No.
And you certainly didn't tell him to cut her neck down to the bone, right?
No.
And when he asked you about raping your mother, you actually talked him out of it, right?
Yes.
And you did so by offering the alternative that he would be able to rape you after the murder, correct?
That's correct.
Wow. Yeah, kill my mom. Don't rape her. Let's draw the line there. This is Gypsy Rose testifying on cross-examination about the killing of her mother done by her boyfriend. Now, we've heard a lot of testimony on both sides of this story. We're going to hear what the verdict is all about when we come back in just a few minutes. First, take a look at these pictures. This is from 2015 when the murders took place. On the right, yeah, that's Gypsy Rose. And you just saw her on the stand. Just what a change from the time that this murder took place. Just unbelievable. So, what's going to happen? We'll have the verdict and more when we come back to Law and Crime.
The angel and the devil. And he talks about considering both. And that at the end, it was his decision, the bitch is dead. His words. Now, no amount of mild autism, level 1, Asperger's changes the fact that you heard him describe it in his own words, that he chose the bitch is dead. And
closing arguments in the Nicholas Godejohn case, that is the prosecution, summing up really what has been the key issue in the whole case. Deliberation, not the jury kind of deliberation, but the thoughtful process that they claim the defendant in this case went through before he killed his girlfriend's mother. Matt Mangino is still with me via Skype. How do you think the prosecution did? Did they hit the one thing that mattered?
Well, yes, they did. I mean, he said early on that there's a lot of stuff in this case, mental illness, child abuse, sex, matricide, gory crime. But really what it boils down to is that issue that he spoke about in his opening statement, deliberation. Did he reflect? Was there a calm, cool reflection before he carried out this murder? And not only did they plan it over an extended period of time, although there was even, some change of heart a couple of weeks out, he stopped and paused right before he went in to kill her, and that is deliberation.
Yeah, that was right in the hallway. He's got the weapon in hand, and he stops. I wonder if I should continue to do this. So if there wasn't any deliberation up to that point, there sure was at that point. So what does the defense do now to fix this?
Well, the defense has to show that there's some reason not to convict him of first-degree murder. There's some reason, some mitigation, diminished capacity, manipulation by Gypsy Blanchard. They're going to have to throw all that on the wall and hope that they can convince the jury that there's some reason not to convict him of first-degree murder.
Okay, well, let's find out if they can throw that stuff against the wall. Let's take a look now at the defense closing argument in the Nicholas Godejohn case.
Nicholas Godejohn is not guilty of first-degree murder simply because he didn't have the ability to deliberate. And it's not as simple as the prosecutor just told you. It's a very complex process. And I'm going to talk about all the things I want you to consider in deciding whether he did in fact deliberate. And I believe when you hear all of what we all have to say, and you think about all of the evidence, you will come to that conclusion. He did not deliberate. She wanted out of that home so bad that she would kill her mother. And let's also not forget why she didn't kill her mother. By that I mean personally. Why didn't she kill her mother? Because she couldn't do it. She couldn't do it. You saw her. Since that he has, it's not real hard to manipulate him, is it? It's not real hard. It was her decision to kill her mother. She talked him into it. He didn't talk her into doing it. She talked him into doing it. Let's talk about Nick Godejohn for a second.
So there is the defense closing argument on behalf of Nicholas Godejohn. I don't know, do you buy it? Is the jury going to buy it that this guy was so weak-minded that Gypsy Rose, the daughter of the victim, was able to basically manipulate him like a puppet? Hey, you know, get a knife. Here it is. I stole it for you. Use this knife. Here are the gloves. All of these factors that suggest by the defense that Gypsy Rose controlled Nicholas Godejohn. Matt Mangino, criminal defense attorney, is that going to be enough to get your guy off?
Well, I don't think they expect to get him off. They hope to get a verdict that's less than first-degree murder. And certainly they've laid it out that Gypsy planned this, that Gypsy got the weapon, that Gypsy made a decision when it was going to happen. Gypsy herself said it was her idea. That's really not the issue here. The issue is, did Nicholas Godejohn have a diminished capacity because of his mental health problems, being on the autism spectrum? Did that in some way limit his ability to deliberate? And if it did, then he could not be guilty of first-degree murder. That's their case.
So maybe a little defensive smokescreen here to dissuade the jury and maybe convince them that there's something more important. But you're right, it comes down to deliberation. So let's find out how the jury deliberated about deliberation. Let's go back into the courtroom for the verdict in Nicholas Godejohn.
The court has reviewed the verdicts and finds them to be in order. It will now announce the verdicts. As to count one, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nicholas Godejohn, guilty of murder in the first degree, as submitted in instruction number 6. We assess and declare the punishment for murder in the first degree at imprisonment for life without the possibility of probation or parole. As to count 2, and that's signed by the foreperson. As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant, Nicholas Godejohn, guilty of armed criminal action as submitted in instruction number 10, signed by the foreperson. Ladies and gentlemen, because only the foreperson signs the verdict forms, I must poll the jury. You'll be asked the following question: are these your verdicts? If they are...
Well, there it is. That is the verdict. Lots of guilty against Nicholas Godejohn in the murder of his girlfriend's mom, Dee Dee Blanchard. Apparently, the jury did not buy the he can't deliberate in his brain. He can't come up with the requisite intent to justify a conviction for first-degree murder. Well, guess what? The jury says he can, and he did. Matt Mangino, surprised after the evidence was laid out as it was by both sides?
No, I wasn't surprised by the verdict in this case. I thought the prosecution did a good job of keeping the jury focused on what the issues were in this case. They could have made a big deal out of trying to refute this idea of diminished capacity, the his mental health issues that were brought up throughout the course of this trial. But they focused and they zeroed in on the most important issue, and they kept the jury focused on that. And I think that was an effective tactic, and it resulted in this first-degree murder conviction.
A quick procedural point here. The jury said, oh, by the way, we sentence him to life without the possibility of probation or parole. Talk for a second about how the jury is instrumental in that sentencing phase.
Well, in Missouri, the jury makes a decision with regard to the sentence. This was not a death penalty case. This was a first-degree murder case, and the jury has the obligation and responsibility to determine the sentence in this case, and they made a decision of life without the possibility of parole.
Yeah, and generally the sentence is followed by the court when they impose that formal sentence, which I believe is going to be in February, maybe March of next year. So, crazy case, one for love. We've got another one coming up for love, but before we get to that, we have a very special segment coming up and a very special guest. I know everybody's familiar with the Denise Williams case and the incredible testimony of Brian Winchester in that love triangle romance murder. Well, we're going to talk about it with a special guest and the case coming up.
He started to yell. And I didn't know how to get out of that situation. And so I had my gun in the boat. And so I loaded my gun, and I made 1 or 2 circles around, and I ended up circling closer towards him, and he was in the water, and as I passed by, I shot him. And I was afraid I was going to have to jump into the water. But I reached down and I grabbed a hold of him. And I was closer, because of where I had driven the boat, I was closer to another landing, just a little dirt landing that was further down the shoreline. And so I decided to motor the boat and pull him over to that landing over there. So I drug him in the water.
Brian Winchester detailing, a gruesome detailing of the killing of his best friend that he did away with so he could get the girl. That's the prosecution's argument, and the case doesn't really even get to trial without this guy's testimony. Via Skype with me still, Matt Mangino. Do we have a case without Brian Winchester?
No. No, this case, sat dormant for, 18, 17 years. So without him coming forward, without his relationship with Mike Williams' wife ultimately, coming apart, we never know about this. We know that Mike Williams is declared dead. We know they had a relationship, but we never would have known that this murder had occurred the way that it did.
Every time I see a witness, I always think, how does the jury react to that witness? In this case, I'm thinking, does his crying make me like him more, hate him more? I don't know what it does, but we'll find out what the jury has to do with this testimony, because we're going to take a look at the verdict now in the case against Denise Williams. Yeah, that's it. And we think, here's the verdict.
Has the jury arrived at a verdict? Would you hand it to the bailiff, please? State of Florida versus Denise Williams. We, the jury, find as follows: as to count 1 of the indictment, the defendant is guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. As to count 2, we, the jury, find the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. We, the jury, find as follows: as to count 3 of the indictment, the defendant is guilty of accessory after the fact of first-degree murder. It's been dated and signed by the foreperson. Ms. Eidlet, did I accurately reflect the verdict of the jury?
There it is, Denise Williams guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder, and we know it's primarily because of the Brian Winchester testimony. So, Matt, tell me of his testimony, because it did go all over the place emotionally and factually. What was the killer? What was the thing that nailed Denise Williams?
Well, I think it was his testimony that she was very much involved in the planning of this murder. That she knew what was going to happen. They had it planned. They went right down to minute details about having Brian Winchester's wife be drunk the night before, so she sleeps in while he goes out and commits the murder. This was a methodically planned murder. It would have probably gone unsolved, other than what happened later in Brian Winchester and Denise Williams' relationship.
Yeah, quite the just a crazy romance tangle there. Thank you very much, Matt Mangino, for joining me today. I appreciate you being along for the maiden voyage here for me at the Law and Crime desk. I hope to see you again soon. Thank you, sir. Now, when we come back, we're going to have a special guest. Everybody's wondered how Brian Winchester got that tremendous deal with the prosecution. How did he arrive at a deal in which he does time for kidnapping, but not for murder? He killed the guy. We're going to talk to his attorney when we come back to Law and Crime.